Hello everybody, I'm happy to be here today. I'll start off with a bit of an outline of today's webinar. I'm glad there's lots of industry and NRM people here today because that is how I've put together my talk with you in mind. There's three main sections. To begin with, we'll just talk a little bit about what causes woody thickening, where's it happening, what are its impacts. Then we'll really get into the nuts and bolts of what we found at Kidman Springs and what that can tell us about how we might manage woody thickening. And for the last part, we get into the nuts and bolts of lighting up. What do we know about things to think about before and after, during, when you're lighting fires to get the best impact on managing your woody cover. So woody thickening, what do we mean when we talk about that? It can either be more plants, more woody plants, more dense woody structure, or it might just be that the plants there are getting bigger. It's both of them. This here is a picture of Kidman Springs in 1973 and again in 1989, and you can see that there's quite a lot of increase in woody cover in that time period. But it isn't just on Kidman Springs that there's been observed woody cover increases. This is a study from the Tropical Savannas CRC by Dave Gillis and Les Searle. And they looked at aerial photography through time in the 1940s and then again in the 1990s for a whole heap of locations on pastoral land across the VRD and the Kimberley. And they found that pretty much universally there was an increase in woody cover at those sites, some more than others, but generally speaking on that pastoral land, woody thickening was occurring. So woody thickening can happen all of a sudden. You can get really good seasons where you get crops of new germination, successful establishment of woody plants. They're often similar in height. You might see them coming through. But it's also just the gradual growth of existing plants year in, year out, and that's often difficult to see or notice if you haven't actually been monitoring it, taking photos every year so you can go back and have a look. But woody plants don't only thicken. Sometimes they thin out as well, and this has been observed in Queensland following droughts, also following wildfires. Often, naturally there'll be thinning of the landscape as well. This is an example of woody thinning, just north of Kidman Springs. So Kidman Springs, the trees have been increasing, but this is from Darrell Lewis's book, Slower Than the Eye Can See, and you can see Jasper Gorge, only about 50 k's north of Kidman. It's actually between 1953 and 1997, there was woody thinning in that area. So what's happening? Why, right next to each other, are we getting reverse trends in woody cover? On pastoral land, we had woody cover increasing. So there's a couple of things that might be influencing increases in woody trees in the Victoria River District, for example. We've had higher rainfall since 1975, and we know that basically as rainfall increases, you get more woody cover. So you can see this going south to north across the territory. As there's more rainfall, there's more woody plants, bigger woody plants, taller. And same as you go west to east across Queensland, where you get more rain, you get more trees. So it's not surprising if rainfall's increased that we'd be getting more woody cover. Interestingly, globally, they're also starting to pick up trends that might suggest that woody cover is responding to increased carbon dioxide. And they know from studies where they've added carbon dioxide to savannas that it tends to help the woody plants grow more than it helps the grass plants grow. So there's some concern that we may actually be getting natural thickening as a result of more carbon dioxide. But that doesn't explain what's happening in the VRD, because on other land uses that aren't pastoral land, woody cover is often declining. But they've still got the higher rainfall and they've still got the more carbon dioxide. So what's going on? Well, the main difference is grazing. And grazing can affect woody cover in two ways. Basically, when there's a lot of grass like there is up in Northern Australia, it's going to be consumed by one of two things. If it's not eaten by a herbivore, it's going to burn. When you have grazed landscapes, there's less grass, and so there's less fuel, and that tends to decrease the incidence of fire. Also, producers often deliberately exclude fire because they want to keep that grass for feeding their cattle. But even just having a more grazed landscape, the fence lines, the roads, they actually act to decrease the likelihood that you have extensive wildfires going on forever, because there tends to be natural little fire breaks throughout the landscape where these things happen. But there is another factor as well, and that is that grazed pastures, if they're heavily grazed, particularly during the wet season, they don't compete with woody plants as much, which can lead to better woody plant growth, because pasture layer and the woody layer, they compete with each other for water and nutrients. But of course, browsing by herbivores can also reduce woody cover. So there's a couple of different factors happening here. In fact, on Kidman Springs, we observed woody thickening both inside and outside exclosures, but the woody thickening was greater where there wasn't grazing. But what's the big deal? The main reason in the pastoral industry is because for some land types in particular, increased woody cover leads to decreased pasture growth, which is our money when we're trying to grow cattle from grass. Interestingly, if you're getting gradual increases in woody cover through time, but your stocking rates are staying the same, but your pasture growth is declining, this can actually lead to a negative spiral, because if you have less grass but the same number of cattle, the grass that does grow is being more heavily grazed, which can actually lead to declines in land condition and can actually exacerbate that cycle of more woody plants, less grass. Mustering costs, sometimes more expensive with small woody plants, but woody plants aren't all bad. There's positives as well. They provide browse, shade for stock, but for low fertility land types in particular, woody plants actually play an important role in soil conditioning. They bring, from their roots which go deeper into the soil than the pasture layer, they bring up nutrients which then become available through leaf fall. It's incorporated into the litter. It leads to increased nutrients and carbon in the soil under trees, which actually can benefit pasture plants. And savannas are not sun limited. So with low densities, low increases of trees, the actual presence of trees gives a little bit of shade, reduces the temperature, reduces the wind speed, which reduces evaporative demand, which actually can increase pasture growth. So we're not talking about all woody plants are bad. We're really talking about getting that happy medium between having enough woody plants for good ecosystem function, but not too many plants so that we're starting to negatively affect pasture growth. So I'd like to hand over to Greg now for a quick poll, just to reflect on that so far.
Sure, not a problem. And I will just quickly launch this poll for everyone. Robyn would like to ask you, is woody thickening a problem in your area? And you can see the selections in front of you there. If you can just put in what would be your best choice, that would be terrific. And as an addition, for you to think about while you're doing that, Robyn would like to ask, if it is thickening, do you think this is a problem for you and why? And if I can get you to just type in your comments into the chat line, and then I can read them to Robyn and she can just respond to those queries if you do have some. So I'll close that off within 3, 2, 1, and I'll close that and I will share it. So 45% Robyn said yes, they do have woody thickening in their area, and it's pretty much spread across the board there. Some do, some don't, and some aren't sure. So I don't see any questions or chat coming in at this present point in time in relation to the answers for that question. One that has come in says, depends on land type.
Yep.
For the woody thickening.
Yep.
So yeah. But yeah, if you can continue, that'd be terrific. I'll just hide that for you.
Yep. So yeah, the response was that it depends on land type is very true. And some land types, studies to do with the effect of woody plants on pasture growth have found that actually the greatest impacts can often be on your most fertile, productive land types. So important when you're trying to graze cattle on those land types. So today we are really here to talk about fire as part of the solution to woody thickening. Australian savannas are adapted to fire, they've evolved with fire. There was fire before Aboriginal people arrived, and then there's been fire since in a more managed way throughout the landscape, often, at various times throughout the year. But since European settlement, the fire incidents have changed, but the way it's changed varies in different ways, in different regions, different land types, different land uses. We had a bit of a look at this in the Victoria River District because we wanted to place the results of our fire experiment in the context of what was actually happening on the ground. So we can see here, this is the Victoria River District with this red border around it, and these boundaries are the stations within the Victoria River District. You can see the locality map here. This is where the VRD is in the Northern Territory. And the different colours show the different land types. So there's pink areas here, defence land. We've got defence land. The green areas are national park. The orange areas are Indigenous land that's used at least partly for grazing. Yellow areas, Indigenous land that's not used for grazing. And those different land types are all in this big sea of blue pastoral leases that are grazed. Now this here is a map from the Nafi fire site, and it shows pretty much this same region, almost to the same scale. Unfortunately I don't have the boundaries over it, but you can see the road going down here is the same road going down here. And what we have here is fire frequency between 2000 and 2013. The white areas didn't burn at all. Those aqua areas only burnt 1 to maybe 3 times in that 14-year period, versus when you're getting into the oranges, reds, purples, you've had 10 or more fires in that period. And what you can see straight away is the defence land stands out pretty well. This patch here and this patch here are these pink patches here. So they've got really high fire frequency. National parks here, we've got a bit of a hot spot here. But more importantly, this U shape of really low fire frequency corresponds to the pastoral land here. And if we look at the sums, on average, across all the different land uses, pastoral land burnt the least. On average, 1 in 5 years, compared to defence, which burnt twice as often. But then, if you look within that different land use, so for example, this is pastoral land, and look at the fire frequency for the different land types, there's variation yet again. So this graph here shows different land types broken down into broad productivity in terms of grazing value. So the high productivity is your black soils, moderate productivity is your good red soils, and the low productivity land types are the ones that are probably not used for grazing, even though they're on pastoral leases, because they will be things like ridges, rocky hills, escarpments, ineffective sand plains, salt areas on the edge of the ocean kind of thing. And what we found was that the areas that are most valuable for grazing are the least likely to burn. So only 1 in 10 years, those black soils are burning. There's actually a lot of variation within that. That's on average across all the black soils. A lot of them didn't burn at all. But when we looked at the low productivity pastoral land, it was burning pretty much as frequently as all the other land uses. So there's quite a bit of variability. So we know that a lot of the pastoral land isn't burning much, particularly the most productive stuff. So what can our experiment tell us about what is the best fire frequency if we want to manage woody plants? So the fire experiments on Kidman Springs in the Victoria River District. We've got 2 sites, a black soil and a red soil. On each of those sites we've looked at different fire seasons, early in June versus late in October, and different intervals of fire. So fires every 2, 4 or 6 years, and these are compared to unburnt controls. This is what the sites look like from the air and the ground. You can see the Firebreaks between the plots. Each of these plots are about 160 by 160 metres in length. This is taken from helicopter hanging out the side of a helicopter. And you can see, this was June last year, even without going and measuring the woody plants, there's some pretty stark contrasts in woody cover between these different fire treatments that can be seen already. So let's look at the numbers. We used the images that we took from the helicopter of the plots through time, and we worked with Charles Darwin University to digitally analyse those photos to get an estimate of woody cover. And then we could look at the difference in cover between 1995 and 2013. The y-axis here is how much woody cover changed during that 17-year period. So 0 means that woody cover stayed the same. Anything above 0 means that woody cover increased. This is the red soil and this is the black soil. On the bottom axis we have the no-burn controls, they're the black points, and then fire intervals of 6, 4 or 2 yearly. And then the red lines are the late burnt plots, which tend to be hot fires, and the early burnt fires are the blue lines. So what we can see straight up is that if you burn every 6 years, either on the red or the black soil, woody cover increases pretty much the same as if you didn't burn at all. In contrast, if you burn every 2 years, you tend to get the least amount of woody cover increase. But you don't really get much more of an effect than if you burn late every 4 years. So from this, it suggests that burning late in the dry season every 4 years will give you management of woody cover. So we're not decreasing woody cover, we're just reducing the amount that it's increasing. But you can see that if you burn early in the year, you're just not getting that same impact. Particularly on the red soils, early burns were not enough to really influence woody cover. So what does this mean in terms of pasture composition? Because we measured that as well. On the red soil, we found that 2 yearly fires not only weren't really required for managing woody plants, they tended to have negative impacts on pasture composition with lower perennial grass yield, more annuals and more forbs, particularly unpalatable ones. Luckily, the 4 yearly late fires, which was good for managing woody cover, didn't affect the total amount of grass, although you did tend to get slightly higher proportion of annuals versus perennials, but it was still a good composition of perennial species. If you burnt early in the year every 4 years, you tended to get a negative impact on the pasture composition, both reduced total amount of grass and reduced perennial grass yields and more unpalatable forbs. So why the difference between early and late 4 yearly burns? We think that what's happening here is that these plots were open to grazing. So cattle were in the paddock and they were free to graze wherever they wanted after fire. And if you have early fires and there's still a bit of soil moisture, they'll resprout, and the cattle love to go and chew those green resprouting pasture plants, which seem to negatively affect the pasture composition through time. And we did measure grazing as well, and we found that those early burnt plots tended to be more heavily grazed than the late burnt plots over time. So we think it's a post-fire grazing impact that's making those early fires detrimental to pasture. We had a similar story on the black soil. 2 yearly or early fire reduced the total amount of pasture, reduced perennial grass yield, and tended to increase the annual grasses. Luckily, the 4 yearly late fire didn't impact yield or composition very much. There's slight differences, but not significantly different from the controls. And again, the 4 yearly early fire did result in lower yields. So that's the long-term kind of average impacts of those different fire treatments. But I thought that people might be interested in knowing what happens in the first year after a burn, because that's when you'd expect the greatest impact. We went and measured the site this year in 2014, in June, and I've just worked out here what the difference was between those plots that were burnt in 2013 versus the long unburnt plots. And after the fires last year, all of the plots were spelled. So this is after a single wet season with a spell. You can see for the grassland, there's very little difference between those recently burnt plots and the long-term unburnt plots. Just goes to show how resilient those pastures and that landscape is to fire. On the woodland, there was a slightly larger impact on pasture composition in the short term, so in the first year after fire. And what we're seeing here really is there's less carryover feed, and there's not as much growth generally on the red soil as the black soil, so it might take a bit longer to catch up to those unburnt sites. So you do expect a slight change the first year after fire, but it's not a long-term impact, and generally just speaking just represents the removal of the litter and the carryover feed that would have otherwise been there. So how does the fire frequency that's happening on pastoral land in the Victoria River District compare to what we're recommending to manage woody cover? On pastoral land, the best grazing land in the VRD currently burns the least. We did a detailed analysis. We found that 89% of the pastoral lease area is currently burning less than the 4-yearly fire that our study suggests is best to manage woody cover, which explains the fact that we've got all that woody thickening happening on pastoral land. Similarly, for the moderate productivity pastoral land, 73% of the moderate productivity pastoral land in the VRD was burning less frequently than 4-yearly. So this suggests that, fire frequency currently on pastoral land on those productive land types is not enough to be managing woody cover. So do we need more or less fire? Because in many areas where there's lots of fires, people have been talking about programs to reduce fire and actually putting those programs in place. And even on pastoral land, where it wasn't grazed, we actually had relatively high fire frequency. And off the pastoral estate, fire frequency was really quite high. And there really is a good argument to decrease fire frequency. Conversely, the least productive pastoral lands might actually present an opportunity for producers to reduce fire frequency for biodiversity benefits, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Not every station will have these low productivity land types that burn quite often, but some of them will, so it will really depend. And there may be an opportunity in the future when the 600 to 1,000 mil savanna burning methodology under the Carbon Farming Initiative is passed, that producers could be involved in projects like that if they have areas that do burn quite frequently. So what did our project tell us about the best timing of fire? Off the pastoral estate, they're promoting early fire to reduce hot, late, dry season fires. But we found in the graze context, if animals are allowed to post-fire graze, it can cause pasture decline. And not only that, the early fires didn't manage woody cover. Really, what you need is 4-yearly late fires if you want to manage both woody cover and pasture composition. So, that's probably raised a lot of questions for people. Happy to hear any questions typed up that people want to ask now.
Okay, thanks, Robyn. And now, ladies and gentlemen, this is your time that if you have any burning questions no pun intended, like to ask Robyn, please get your fingers typing and type them into the question box, and I can read them out to Robyn. So, Robyn, we do have one observation from one of the attendees in the Charters Towers area where very heavily grazed lands have not thickened as cattle have eaten woody plants before they're out of the browse height. And country grazed lightly and fire retained is also more open. And the moderately stocked areas are the ones with woody increase, reduced fire frequency and a little browsing. So that's one of the comments that came in. Now the question there was there any further interaction with stage of woody infestation?
Yeah, so are you talking about plant height maybe, or how thick the woody plants already are?
It doesn't go into that much detail with the question.
We didn't, well, we do know, and I'll talk about it in the next section, that the best time to be applying fire to manage woody cover is before they're taller than 2 metres high, which often sounds problematic because you think, well, I'm not worried about them when they're that high because they're just little and they're not really causing that much problem. But that's when fire can really impact on them the most. So studies that Rod Dye did at the site for his master's thesis found that the smaller the plants were, so the younger they are, presumably, the more effective fire was in managing them. And if you have already converted to, which sometimes is the case and has occasionally occurred in the Victoria River District, even on some of the floodplains, up in Bradshaw, for example, it's been documented that there's been a complete transformation from a grassland to a woodland, so that there's not really even any grass growing under anymore, and then fire isn't, the time passed because it's not really, you can't get a fire in there anymore. So timing is important in terms of where you are in the woody thickening cycle. But I'll talk a little bit more in the next section too about, you know, sometimes you can get the right fire to get onto, you know, quite a woody area, even if they are a bit taller than 2 metres.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And just to clarify, the person that put that question in was referring to the structural height and age of the woody infestation. Yep. Another quick question. How can you separate the grazing effects from the fire effects in the early fire treatments when making recommendations of timing of fire?
Okay. So can you just read that again, please, Greg?
Yeah. How can you separate the grazing effects from the fire effects in the early fire treatments when making recommendations of timing of fire?
Yep. Look, the truth is they are inextricably linked. This experiment didn't allow us to separate them because it's grazing on all of the plots. But what we did find was that the early plots did have heavier grazing sometimes. So I guess it was a hint that it may have been post-fire grazing that's causing that. I mean, the other factor too, I guess, is that those early fires might be benefiting woody cover because there's less competition from the pasture because the pasture has been removed. There's a longer period between when you're burning in June and when it rains in December for those early plots versus those late October burnt plots. So it could be a, you know, it could be a competition thing as well. It's a good point.
Okay, just to let everyone know, there's a lot of questions that are coming in. We will try and get through as many as we can. For any of those that we cannot get through in this particular session, I will forward on to Robyn and she can give them an answer to those questions, and I can make sure that everyone gets a copy of those answers to those questions that were unanswered, if that makes sense. And we'll have one last question before we move on, Robyn. Are the fires generally killing the woody weeds or just suppressing their growth?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is they don't kill them, generally speaking. Rod Dye did a lot of studies on mortality of the different species on the different sites, and generally speaking, you get a maximum mortality of about 5%. What it does is it suppresses them. It keeps them relatively small. They're still there. What we don't know is how it might affect really tiny little seedlings. Maybe fire is better at, you know, getting those really small plants. But of course that depends on the species, and if you have acacias, for example, which did occur on the site sometimes, fire will kill all of them and then you'll get a new crop germinating pretty much straight away as well. So it does depend on species, but generally speaking, most of the woody plants on these sites are very resilient to fire.
Okay, thank you. I'm very conscious of time and we might continue with the presentation.
Okay. So the next bit is kind of getting to the nuts and bolts of how to use fire. And today, just a reminder, we're really talking about using fire to manage woody cover. Fire can be used for lots of other reasons, and you might need different types of fires for other reasons. But today we're particularly talking about managing woody cover. And I'll just let you know that I'm certainly not an expert in this. These are things that we've kind of worked out from our research and applying fires ourselves. But, you know, other people might have some interesting insights as well. And I would also recommend that you look at Cole Payton's webinar, which you can find through the Future Beef website as well. And he talks about fire, which is especially relevant for the more southern kind of Queensland areas. So if you're going to be burning, there is a lot of pre-fire planning. I probably don't need to tell you that you might need to spell before to get enough fuel, and we would recommend spelling after to promote a healthy pasture recovery. It might be important to think about whether or not you're going to get a good season after, and whether or not the long-range forecast is relevant to your region will vary, of course. Whether or not it's going to matter will depend on your situation and whether or not there's enough forage, even if there's not a big year the following year, or how much of the country that you're burning. There's the general things like making sure you've got permits, letting the neighbours know, putting in your fire breaks, testing all your equipment, making sure you've got it all running, having a grader on hand for those escapee fire jumpers, getting training. Our group got training from bushfires in the NT. I'm sure there's always opportunities in different areas. This is our fire break. We've got 2 grader widths. The top left is in June last year, and then after we wet season spelled it, that would carry a pretty good fire across that fire break. So last year's fire break is not this year's fire break. They require continual maintenance. So when should you or should you not burn? A couple of things that we've learned. We'd recommend burning when you've got a grass to get an effective fire. If you don't have enough grass and you're not going to get that impact on woody cover, maybe it's better to wait for a better year to burn. Having good continuous cover, so not too much kind of patchiness between clumps, bare ground, because then the fire might not carry. As I mentioned before the plants get too high and out of the reach of the flames. For wattles, which actually are killed by fire, fire will then stimulate germination of a whole new crop of woody plants, which if you have a follow-up fire in the next year or two, will then actually have a bigger impact on those wattles over the longer term. So if you can get in and burn again before the next crop of wattle plants are big enough to be producing their own seeds, then you can have a more long-term effect on thick wattle areas. And that might be just something that you apply initially just to get on top of the wattle if it's a particular issue. So we found burning late in the dry season or spring for southerners, when there's some breeze to just carry across, you know, gaps, whatever, but not too much breeze because it's dangerous. And you don't want the fire to be moving too quickly because it might not burn those woody plants like you want it to. But we wouldn't recommend burning, you know, particular fire-sensitive vegetation that might be particularly unique, have biodiversity value for your area. So, for example, areas where there might be spring soaks, gorges, you might have some kind of remnant monsoon vine thickets, or you might have some patches of lancewood that you actually want to keep, cypress pine. Up in the Northern Territory, these on some of the more frequently burnt areas, lancewood and cypress pine is disappearing. If you're a producer, that might not bother you. We don't think you should burn if you don't have enough fuel to be effective. And we think it actually can have a negative effect. If you burn a fire and it removes all the pasture, but it doesn't affect the woody plants, that could result in the woody plants being advantaged because they haven't got the competition from the pasture layer. So, you know, and it's a lot of effort to go into if you're not going to get the results that you want. So you don't have to be prescriptive about burning every 4 years. You're trying to get around about every 4 years, but it's sensible to burn when's the best time to get the best result. Our colleagues found that when they put a fire through some poor condition annual shortgrass pastures, kind of seed condition stuff, a hot fire actually removed the soil seed bank and it really didn't recover afterwards and was quite deleterious. It took quite a few years for those to come back. So that's something to think about too when you're burning. You might decide not to burn if follow-up seasons are likely to be poorer, or if you can't spell after the burn. So again, that might be season dependent, or just depending on where you can put stock if you want to spell after. So what are we really looking for in a fire? We found that the late dry season fires are more effective, and this is bearing in mind that the late dry season fires tend to have less fuel because we had grazing occurring between the early and late dry season fires, and they did have slightly lower fuel loads than the early dry season fires. But they were more effective because the drier, hotter conditions, the more cured fuel led to higher flame height. And it's the flame height that really affects whether or not it's going to affect the woody canopy and woody plants. We found that some slight breeze to carry the fire can be useful, particularly if, fuel's maybe not as much as you'd like, but again, not too much for safety and containment reasons. Burning late, burning every 4 years or so. This is an example of a cool June fire, and it may be sensible occasionally to have these kind of fires for other reasons, but you can see here that after the fire's been through, the fuel wasn't 100% cured. There's still green bits that didn't burn. There's litter that didn't burn, which is, probably quite good in terms of ground cover, biodiversity outcomes, less greenhouse gas emission. But you can see the reason that it's not very effective is the flame really didn't go any higher than the grass, and so it's not. It removed these leaves down low, but they're all fine up here. It really hasn't been very effective in terms of managing woody cover. So how much fuel is enough? Generally speaking, the more fuel, the hotter the fire, and the higher the flames, which will give you a better top kill of woody plants. So top kill is just burning, killing the leaves, maybe some of the stems of the woody plants. It doesn't kill the plant, it just removes that, that green, leaf area on top. But the roots and the stems are still alive and they regrow back from there. Generally speaking, you're aiming for at least 1,500 kilograms per hectare. That's the grass and the litter. So these particular photos here are of a plot that had about, on average, it varied as you can see, it was thicker in some parts than others, of about 350 kilograms per hectare of grass, but that was plenty of fuel when you take into account there's also litter and other things there adding to fuel for the fire. So this was a plot that we burnt October last year. It was a late 6-yearly burnt plot, so it hadn't been burnt for a long time and it was really quite woody. This is the plot. You can see the flames really did go quite high. It burnt really quite well. And it actually burnt, I guess, better than we'd intended because there was a bit of gust of wind and a wind change and it just went gavoompa, which is always problematic. It was problematic because the fire then jumped over our massively wide northern break of about 4 grader widths and we had to go and chase it with a grader to contain it. So that's an example of, where the wind did contribute to difficulty containing that fire. This is what it looked like immediately after the fire. So you can see it was a very clean burn. There's basically no pasture layer left at all. The leaves, if they haven't been burnt, they've been scorched right up into the high parts of the canopy. So it looks pretty devastated, but 6 months later after wet season spell, this is what it looks like. You can see the woody plants aren't dead, they're still alive, they're regrowing, resprouting, but it's much more open than the canopy that we had in this plot originally. Now, we wouldn't necessarily recommend, quite a large hot fire as this, but I guess it's a good example of if woody plants have gotten away from you, how sometimes you can still get a good fire in and actually get a good. So here, these woody plants were more than 2 metres high, and yet we had quite a large effect on that woody canopy cover. The woody plants are still there, they're still contributing. We're not trying to get rid of them, but it has opened up that plot quite a lot. This is an example on the black soil last year. There's much higher fuel loads on this plot, more than 2,000 kilos per hectare. You can see that this area's cane grass, Ophiuris, was really quite high fuel loads there, but it was patchier in other parts of it. The wind speed was ranging from about 5 to 10 kilometres per hour, kind of gusts to 10. We've got a really good fire going through it. You can see the flame heights getting up into that the woody canopy cover. This is what it looked like the next day, and you can see the top of these haven't been affected, but there's scorching happening closer to the ground. You can see these grey kind of areas in the background are actually shrubs that were quite affected by the fire. And then this is 6 months later after a wet season spell. So really good pasture growth, pasture cover. The woody plants, you can see there's been quite a lot of top kill and quite it's opened up the canopy. But they're still alive, they're still there to survive another day. So an example of where you don't have enough fuel, here the flame is low, it's really patchy. We couldn't even really light the fire here. There'd been lots of repeated grazing. This is on one of our 2 yearly burnt sites. It's declined over time because it's been burnt too often. We've got less perennial grass. It's getting heavily grazed. And you can see that the flame height, one, it doesn't really carry, and 2, it's not very high. And although it'll kind of flare up around the odd conkerberry bush, the flame height's not enough to really affect woody cover. This is on the black soil, similar story here. They've been quite heavy grazing. You can see not only, you know, when it does burn, the flame height's very low and just creeps along. There's big bare areas where the fire just doesn't carry at all. We actually had to carry a drip torch into the plot, which obviously you cannot do in a large paddock. You need to carry across the area that you want to burn because they're large areas. This is a black soil where there is plenty of fuel, but again, you can see that grazing has made it quite patchy in between the tussocks. And here, there was almost no wind at all, and so the fire wasn't really carrying across those grazed areas to the next tussock. So that's an example of where just that little bit of wind would have combined with that fuel load to get a good outcome for woody cover. This is an example of how woody pasture cover can be really very good with a wet season spell. So this is one of the red soil plots 6 months after it had been burnt. It had been wet season spelled. So this is black speargrass around here, and in here is native cooch. If grazing had occurred over the wet season, that would have been all bare because that would have been completely grazed out and it would have been very patchy cover. But as it was, that wet season spell meant that it's really continuous cover and the fire would easily carry across that. Not that it needs that, because as you can see it's quite open because it's been burnt recently. This is on the black soil. Obviously you don't need this much cover, but it just demonstrates how the difference between a heavily grazed and a very lightly or ungrazed area. Here the tussocks are still there, but between it's covered in pasture as well. So far we've been talking about assuming that you might burn a whole paddock and spell a whole paddock if you're going to spell. But we have also done research into rotationally burning paddocks, which we did at Mount Sanford from the late 1990s through the 2000s. We divided a paddock up into 4 areas, and we used to burn a quarter of that paddock in a rotational way each year to give 4 yearly fire. What we did find, though, was that areas that were burnt are grazed more heavily, and you could see that in the following wet season. So you need to make sure that the areas that you're burning are large enough that they won't be too heavily grazed if you're leaving the stock in there. And you need to make sure that you burn not too much of the paddock, but you've still got enough unburnt pasture left for the stock to eat as well. So, look, I really don't know the answer, but somewhere between a quarter to a half of the paddock, something I would suggest if you're thinking about burning parts of the paddock. Obviously don't burn the same part each year. Another thing we found was that because cattle prefer burnt areas, they attracted more grazing there. When we burnt near the water, it was hammered because cattle already hang out there anyway, spend more time there. So if there are areas that are already overgrazed by cattle and you're only going to burn part of the paddock, you probably shouldn't burn those parts. That's if you can get a fire into it. So things to think about with stock management. If pastures are open to grazing post-fire, that can lead to poorer pasture conditions. So you need to manage that either by managing stocking rates or spelling. We think it probably is best to destock and spell after fire until the pasture is regrown and set seed. And then sometimes you need to spell prior to burning as well, particularly if woody covers really starting to have an impact on pasture growth. It might help to have that continuous cover to carry a fire as well. You might be able to plan your stock movements to fit in with other musters. So for example, you might decide you're going to burn in the following October, and you think, well, I need a wet season spell before then so I have enough fuel and I can really get in and manage that woody cover. So I'm going to take the stock out at the second round muster. So it's October, a year before you're going to burn. You might decide you need to leave the stock out so that that fuel isn't grazed until the time that you want to burn. And then you might decide, well, I really want to improve pasture composition as well. I want to make sure that the pastures regrow very healthily after fire. So you might decide to keep the stock out until the first round muster after you've burned as well, which if you add all that time up could add up to 18 months. Now, that's, I guess, a worst case scenario of the amount of time that you might decide you want to have stock out of the paddock to enable a burn. But, you know, you might be able to find other ways in between. You might have put them in sooner, you might have a bit of grazing in between spell, you might not need to spell because you might have enough fuel anyway. Another thing to think about is making sure that if you are taking stock out of the paddock and putting them into other paddocks, that they're not leading to too high stocking rates in other paddocks, which could cause decline in pasture condition elsewhere and potentially lead to increases in woody cover if other areas are overgrazed. It's possible that you could mix fire with other goals. So we know that fire improves pasture quality when you remove the rank pasture. It also leads to better live weight gains. Fire has also been found to improve the evenness of grazing. So cattle are known to patch graze. They like to go back to the same area that's being grazed and graze it down again because there's more nutritious green pasture regrowing. When you burn a paddock, it resets that patch grazing so that it can contribute to more even grazing of the landscape, which can be quite good. Fire can be used as part of your weed control, particularly for exotic woody plants. Also, it's been used in rubber vine in North Queensland quite successfully as part of that management of rubber vine. And you might decide to combine spelling with your fire, as we've been discussing, to get both better pasture condition and managing your woody cover. So that's all I have today. There's lots of links for further information that Greg will send out to you afterwards, but open to questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Wonderful presentation, and yes, we do have other questions coming in for you, Robyn. One of the questions is there a benefit to increase perennial grass cover for grazing, and how could this be done? Wet season fire use targeting annual species?
Yep. So an example that I can think of is where you've got a lot of annual sorghum and you're hoping to promote perennial pasture by burning those annual plants before they set seed. That is something that people do talk about. We haven't actually tested that, but you need to be careful that there is that perennial, I guess, seed base that can take advantage if you do take out that annual grass. But certainly people have used fire to change pasture composition. We found that no matter what fire, you tended to get a slight, at least in the short term, a slight increase in annuals and decrease in perennial grasses. I think that's just because it opens up the pasture, removes all that litter, which creates those spaces for the annual plants to germinate between perennial tussocks. Didn't cause a massive change in composition, but it did just cause that slight flush and annuals immediately post-fire, but that's not burning in the wet season. What that question was about was when you burn after those annual plants have grown, germinated, so that you can remove them before they set seed. And you know, I think if it's something that's relevant to you, I'd give it a little trial area, see how it goes.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you very much. Do you have any observations on the direction of the burn? For example, front fire versus back burn, and what are the effects on woody change?
I actually don't know if there is any effect. It's not something I've noticed or that we've measured, so I'm not sure I can comment on that. I do know that if it was a bit windier than we wanted, we'd make sure we do a back burn first and around the sides before we lit up that front fire, just to give us a bit of safety and margin. But conversely, if it was really not very windy, or if we were really light on fuel but we wanted to get the most effective fire, then we would go with a front fire to try and encourage that fire to move across the pasture, go with the wind, use the wind to actually get a more effective fire.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I'm conscious of time. We just got a couple more questions to get through, which I'm sure we can do. How and when did the Aborigines burn to maintain the perennial grasses that were present before European management?
Well, there's a fair bit of research that's been done into fire regimes before European settlement, and they did tend to burn throughout the year, so they didn't just burn one time of year. There'd be different patches of land being burned at different times throughout the year, so that, you know, the explorers talked about there being smoke, you know, for a large part of the year somewhere in the landscape. In terms of promoting perennial grasses, we know even now that without grazing on some of the indigenous land, for example, it's the best place to go and get perennial grass seed, because they're getting the fires, but there's not the heavy grazing from cattle. There's obviously wallabies and things. Those perennial grasses do fine. They do really well. So I think it's the combination of fire and grazing that can knock back perennial grasses. But fire itself, perennial grasses are really resilient too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And our last question for today is, do you have any financial analysis of the cost of fire?
We have done some, and we're going to do more. And there's also Rod Dyer did a long-term analysis with Mark Stafford Smith, which I can give the details of if you like. But yeah, a couple of years ago I did an analysis of the impacts of if we were going to implement early fire as per recommendations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions versus if we implement late fire as per recommendation to manage woody cover, and what impact that would have over time. And there was a real cost over time because you're getting increased woody cover on those early burnt scenarios, which leads to declines in pasture growth and carrying capacity, which led to reduced economic benefits over time. And we plan to do some more along those lines as well. So happy to take advice if people have got some questions we want to look into.